What happens when you tell a human something is impossible? When an alien girl challenges a 14-year-old boy to return as a man, and he actually does it. Today's story is about the first human to survive trials that killed every other species who tried. But was he really ready for what he found waiting for him? Sometimes the most powerful promises aren't made with words. They're made with a kiss on the forehead and a challenge that changes everything. 10 years ago, a 14-year-old human boy named Eli Vance made a choice that would haunt him for a decade. He saved an alien girl's life on a planet where humans weren't supposed to exist. She told him to come back when he was no longer a boy. He did. But what he found was more than he ever imagined. This is the story of a promise that bridged two worlds, three trials that no alien had ever survived, and the moment humanity proved it belonged among the stars. It's a story about what happens when pure human stubbornness meets impossible odds, and why sometimes the most dangerous thing you can tell a human is that something can't be done. Because if there's one thing our species has perfected over the millennia, it's the art of taking impossible challenges personally. You see, by 2387, humanity had been part of the galactic community for exactly 37 years. And in those 37 years, we'd managed to start 2 diplomatic incidents, accidentally violate 16 sacred cultural taboos, and somehow convince half the galaxy that we were either dangerously unpredictable or refreshingly honest. Sometimes both. The Galactic Council had a special classification for us: probationary species with supervision required. It was diplomatic speak for "we're not sure if you're going to save the galaxy or accidentally blow it up, so we're going to keep a very close eye on you." Most humans found this patronizing. Eli Vance found it motivating. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me paint you a picture of who Eli was before he became the first human to achieve something the galaxy thought was impossible. Picture a kid from New Montana, one of humanity's outer colony worlds, where the biggest excitement was usually whether the hydroponics bay would produce enough tomatoes for the annual harvest festival. Eli grew up fixing atmospheric processors and dreaming about the stars raised by a single mother who worked double shifts at the terraforming station just to keep food on the table. His father was one of those men who found the weight of responsibility heavier than the pull of adventure. He left when Eli was 8, chasing some get-rich-quick scheme involving asteroid mining that everyone except him knew was doomed to fail. That abandonment could have broken the kid. Instead, it forged him into someone who believed that when you make a promise to someone, you keep it, no matter what. So when 14-year-old Eli won a lottery spot on an educational transport to the inner systems, his mother scraped together everything she had to send him on the trip of a lifetime. It was supposed to be 2 weeks of visiting established colonies, was learning about humanity's place in the galaxy, and maybe getting inspired to pursue a career in xenobiology or diplomatic service. It was supposed to be safe. The universe, as it turns out, has a twisted sense of humor when it comes to what's supposed to happen. The transport ship Endeavour was 3 days out from Earth when everything went wrong. And I mean everything. It started with what the ship's computer cheerfully announced as minor navigational anomaly. In spacer terminology, that's like calling a Category 5 hurricane light precipitation. The ship's jump drive had malfunctioned, throwing them off course by approximately 17 light years and into a region of space that wasn't on any human star charts. Captain Martinez, a veteran of the Titan freight runs, who'd seen pretty much everything space could throw at a ship, took one look at their position and started using words that would have made a dock worker blush. They were in Thalrune space. Specifically, they were drifting powerless toward Thalrune Prime, the species' homeworld, with failing life support and a communication array that was sparking like a defective firework. Now, the Thalrune weren't exactly hostile to humanity, but they weren't what you'd call friendly either. They were one of the older species in the galactic community, the kind who measured time in millennia instead of decades, and viewed younger species with the sort of patience you'd show to particularly energetic puppies. They also had strict laws about unauthorized entry into their space. The kind of laws that involve lengthy detention, extensive questioning, and the very real possibility of spending the next few years in what they politely called cultural rehabilitation. Captain Martinez managed to get off one distress call before the communication array died completely, but he wasn't optimistic about rescue. Thalrun's space was vast, their ship was dark and drifting, and even if the authorities found them diplomatic, immunity was a concept that worked much better in theory than in practice. That's when the ship started breaking apart. The structural integrity fields that kept the Endeavour in one piece had been damaged in the same incident that killed their jump drive. What followed was every spacer's worst nightmare, a slow-motion catastrophe, as the ship literally came apart around them. Eli found himself in Escape Pod 7 with 3 other passengers when the ship's spine finally snapped. The pod's emergency systems launched them toward the nearest planetary body, which happened to be Thalrun Prime, and specifically toward a continent that the pod's limited sensors identified as geologically stable and probably not immediately lethal. High praise from emergency equipment. The crash landing was everything you'd expect from a piece of emergency gear designed by the lowest bidder. The pod hit the surface hard enough to rattle Eli's teeth, bounced twice, and came to rest upside down in what turned out to be a forest of crystalline trees that sang in harmonies no human ear was designed to hear. Of the 4 people in the pod, Eli was the only one conscious when the dust settled. The others were breathing but unresponsive victims of concussion and shock that left Eli, a 14-year-old kid from a farming colony, as the only mobile survivor on an alien world. He spent the first day trying to wake his fellow passengers, the second day trying to get the pod's emergency beacon working, the third day accepting that if rescue was coming, it wasn't coming soon, and that he needed to find water and food, or they were all going to die very slowly. That's when he heard the screams. They echoed through the crystal forest like nothing he'd ever heard before, a sound that bypassed his brain and went straight to the part of his nervous system that had kept his ancestors alive on the African savanna. Every instinct he had told him to hide, to stay quiet, to wait for whatever was making that sound to go away. But those screams weren't just sounds. They were someone in mortal terror, someone who was about to die unless someone else decided to help. Eli Vance had never been accused of being the smartest kid in his class. His teachers back on New Montana described him as adequate in most subjects, though they noted he had an unusual talent for getting into trouble when he thought someone was being treated unfairly. What Eli had, what his mother had recognized and tried to nurture despite their circumstances, was an overdeveloped sense of right and wrong that occasionally overwhelmed his sense of self-preservation. So when he heard those screams, he didn't hide. He didn't wait for help. He grabbed the biggest piece of debris he could find and went looking for whoever was about to die. Through the crystalline trees that hummed with some kind of internal energy, past rock formations that seemed to shift and change when he wasn't looking directly at them, Eli followed the sound of terror and found something that would reshape his understanding of what was possible in the universe. Her name, he would later learn, was Elia. She had skin that seemed to capture and hold starlight, giving her an ethereal glow that made her look like she'd stepped out of a fairy tale. Her hair was the color of deep forest jade, but it moved with a life of its own, flowing around her shoulders like liquid energy. She was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with human standards of attractiveness, and everything to do with the fact that she seemed to embody some fundamental principle of grace and harmony that Eli had never seen before. She was also about to be torn apart by 3 creatures that looked like they'd crawled out of humanity's collective nightmares. The Void Stalkers, as he'd later learned they were called, stood nearly 8 feet tall on legs that bent in too many places. Their arms ended in claws that could slice through starship hull plating, and their heads were elongated skulls filled with teeth that seemed designed for the specific purpose of causing maximum terror before causing maximum damage. They moved with the fluid, coordinated precision of pack hunters circling Elia with the patience of predators who knew their prey had nowhere to run. Any rational person would have hidden. Any smart person would have tried to get back to the crash site and hoped the stalkers would finish their business and move on. Any sensible person would have recognized that a 14-year-old human boy with no weapons and no training had absolutely no chance against 3 apex predators. Eli Vance had never been accused of being rational, smart, or sensible. He grabbed a jagged piece of crystal that he had broken off from one of the trees, hefted it like the baseball bat he'd used in Little League back home, and charged. What happened next was less heroic battle and more controlled disaster. Eli managed to catch the stalkers by surprise, mainly because the concept of a prey species deliberately attacking predators was so far outside their understanding that they hesitated for just a moment. That moment was enough for Eli to brain one of them with his makeshift weapon and send it stumbling backward. It was also enough for Alia to break free from the circle they'd formed around her and put some distance between herself and the remaining two. But three Void Stalkers, even with one temporarily stunned, were still more than a match for one untrained human boy. The claws that caught Eli across the chest opened him up from his left shoulder to his right hip, sending him crashing to the ground in a spray of blood that looked shockingly red against the alien landscape. As he lay there bleeding out on soil under stars he'd never seen before, Eli had a moment of perfect clarity. He was going to die. He was going to die on a world whose name he didn't know, and no one would ever know what had happened to him. But he'd done the right thing. He'd tried to help someone who needed help, and even if it cost him everything, he couldn't bring himself to regret it. That's when Alia made a decision that would echo through both their lives for the next decade. She could have kept running. The stalkers were focused on their injured prey now, and she could have disappeared into the crystal forest and been safe. It would have been the smart thing to do, the sensible thing. Instead, she came back. What followed was Eli's first glimpse of what advanced alien technology could accomplish. Alia moved her hands over his wounds, and they began to close. Not heal exactly, but knit back together as if time was moving backward. Her hands glowed with soft golden light, and wherever that light touched, the pain receded. She worked in focused silence, occasionally glancing at his face with an expression he couldn't quite read. When she finally spoke, her voice carried an accent that sounded like wind chimes in a gentle breeze, musical and alien but somehow soothing. "Why did you help me? Your kind usually doesn't interfere in affairs that don't concern them." Eli, still dizzy from blood loss and whatever she'd done to heal him, managed a weak smile. "Where I come from, we don't let people get eaten by nightmare bugs if we can help it." She studied him for a long moment with eyes that were the color of amber, with flecks of gold eyes that seemed to look right through him and see things he wasn't sure he wanted anyone to see. "You're just a child," she said finally. "I'm 14, he protested, trying to sound more mature than he felt. "That's practically an adult." For the first time, Elia smiled. It was like watching a sunrise on an alien world, beautiful and completely foreign, but somehow warming in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. "No, little warrior," she said gently. "You're still a boy. You have the heart of someone worthy, but you lack the wisdom and strength that come with true maturity." Eli felt something sink in his chest. After everything he'd just been through, after nearly hiding to save her, she was dismissing him as just a kid. "But perhaps," Elia continued, and something in her tone made him look up at her again, "perhaps one day you'll return as a man." Then she did something that would burn itself into Eli's memory forever. She leaned down and pressed her lips gently to his forehead. It wasn't romantic, not exactly. It was something deeper, more profound. It was recognition. It was blessing. It was challenge. It was promise. "Come back when you're no longer a boy," she whispered, her breath warm against his skin. "We don't give promises to children, but when you're shady, when you have become who you're meant to be, find me." She pressed something into his palm, a small crystal that pulsed with the same golden light as her healing hands. "This will prove that tonight happened, that it wasn't just a dream brought on by injury and shock." "How will I find you?" Eli asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You'll know," Elia said simply. "When you're ready, you'll know." The rescue ships found Eli 2 weeks later, delirious and barely coherent, clutching a crystal pendant that shouldn't have existed according to every xenogeologist who examined it. His story was filed under traumatic hallucination, possibly brought on by alien atmospheric toxins, and he was shipped back to New Montana with a recommendation for psychological counseling. But Eli knew what had happened. He knew what he'd experienced, and more importantly, he knew what he'd been challenged to become. 10 years. That's how long it took Eli Vance to transform himself from a scared kid into something else entirely. And let me tell you, it wasn't a transformation that happened by accident. The day Eli returned to New Montana, he made a decision that would shape the next decade of his life. He was going to become worthy of Elia's challenge. He was going to become the man she'd seen potential for in that bleeding, desperate boy. But first, he had to figure out what that meant. He threw himself into research with the single-minded intensity that only teenagers can muster. He learned everything he could about the Thalrun, which wasn't much considering humanity's limited contact with them. He studied xenobiology, alien psychology, comparative cultural analysis. He learned 17 different alien languages, including 2 that required surgical modification of his vocal cords to pronounce correctly. He joined the Terran Colonial Defense Force the day he turned 18, not because he wanted to be a soldier, but because they had the most comprehensive xenological training programs available to civilians. He excelled at everything they threw at him, not because he was naturally gifted, but because failure wasn't an option he was willing to consider. His commanding officers noted his unusual dedication to studying alien cultures and recommended him for the Diplomatic Corps' accelerated training program. By the time he was 22, Eli Vance was Captain Eli Vance, one of the youngest officers ever to achieve diplomatic certification with the Thalrun cultural specialization. But the real breakthrough came when he discovered what Aelia had really been referring to when she told him to come back when he was ready. The Trial of Unity. Hidden in the depths of Thalrun cultural archives, accessible only to certified xenologists, with the highest security clearances, was reference to an ancient ritual that supposedly measured not just strength or intelligence, but the very essence of a being's soul. The trial had 3 parts, each designed to test a different aspect of worthiness. The first measured one's ability to face personal darkness without being consumed by it. The second tested harmony with life itself. The third and most dangerous was called the bonding, a complete merger of consciousness with a Thalrun guardian that required absolute trust and complete vulnerability. No human had ever attempted the Trial of Unity. Hell, most aliens didn't survive it either. The archives contained records of hundreds of attempts over the centuries with a success rate that made Russian roulette look like a safe bet, but Eli had never been deterred by impossible odds. So when Captain Eli Vance, decorated officer of the Terran Diplomatic Corps, requested assignment to the Thalrun sector, his commanding officers thought it was about advancing human-alien relations and furthering his already impressive career. They had no idea it was about keeping a promise made to a boy who no longer existed. The journey to Thalrun Prime took 3 weeks aboard the diplomatic vessel Harmony, and Eli spent every moment of that time preparing himself mentally for what he was about to attempt. He meditated, he studied, he practiced the mental exercises that Thalrun philosophy claimed were essential for spiritual preparation. But nothing could have prepared him for the sensory assault of actually returning to the world that had shaped his destiny. The first thing that hit him when he stepped off the transport shuttle wasn't the sight of Thalrun's golden spires reaching toward 3 setting suns, though they were magnificent in a way that made human architecture look like children's blocks by comparison. It wasn't the harmony of crystalline wind chimes that seemed to grow from the very air itself, creating music that existed at the intersection of sound and mathematics. It was the smell, something like cinnamon mixed with ozone and the faint metallic tang of energy weapons on standby. Because apparently his arrival hadn't gone unnoticed. The Thalrun delegation waiting for him looked like they'd stepped out of a fever dream, painted by someone who'd never met a subtle color. Their ceremonial robes shifted between deep purples and electric blues, and their skin had that same starlight quality he remembered from Alia, though none of them were her. "Captain Vance," the lead delegate spoke in perfect, if slightly musical English. "Welcome to Thalrun. I am Elder Zethmarin of the Cultural Exchange Council. We understand you have requested an audience with our Guardian Council regarding a matter of significant cultural importance." Eli straightened his diplomatic uniform and tried to look like he belonged there instead of like a man chasing a 10-year-old memory across the galaxy. "That's correct, Elder. I come seeking permission to attempt the Trial of Unity." The silence that followed was so complete, Eli could hear his own heartbeat echoing off the crystal spires in the distance. It was the kind of silence that preceded either laughter or violence, and he wasn't sure which would be worse. Finally, Elder Zethmarin spoke, and his voice carried a note that might have been amusement or might have been pity. "Captain, with respect, no human has ever attempted the trial. The physiological and psychological requirements. Most who try, regardless of species, do not survive the experience. And those who survive but fail, well, let's just say the trial has a way of revealing truths people aren't prepared to face." "I'm prepared," Eli said, though even as the words left his mouth, he wondered if anyone could truly be prepared for something like this. "We shall see," Zethmarin replied. But first you must gain permission from the guardian who speaks for candidates. That would be Guardian Elia of the First Circle. And just like that, 10 years of wondering, 10 years of preparation, 10 years of building himself into someone worthy of an impossible promise came to an end. She appeared at the top of the crystal steps like something out of a dream he'd never quite been able to shake. Elia had grown into her beauty in a way that made Eli's 14-year-old memory seem pale and inadequate. She moved down the crystal steps with fluid grace, each movement deliberate and purposeful, her jade hair now woven with threads of silver that caught the triple sunlight like captured stars. She wore the robes of a guardian, now flowing garments that seemed to shift color with her movements, and there was an authority in her bearing that spoke of years spent making decisions that affected entire worlds. But her eyes, those amber eyes with flecks of gold, were exactly as he remembered. They looked right through him, just like they had 10 years ago, as if she could see every secret he'd ever kept and every fear he'd ever harbored. "So," she said, her voice carrying that same wind chime quality he remembered, though deeper now, richer with experience and responsibility, "the boy returns." "Actually," Eli replied, fighting to keep his voice steady, despite the fact that his heart was trying to beat its way out of his chest. "The man returns, just like you suggested." Elia descended the remaining steps, slowly circling him like a predator, sizing up prey. Or maybe like an artist examining a sculpture that wasn't quite what she'd ordered. "You've grown," she admitted, and Eli could hear the careful evaluation in her tone. "Broader shoulders, harder eyes, scars on your hands from weapons training. You carry yourself like someone who's been tested and survived." She paused directly in front of him, close enough that he could smell that same energy, and starlight scent he remembered, close enough that he could see the faint patterns of bioluminescence that played across her skin like living tattoos. "But are you truly no longer a boy, Eli Vance?" Hearing his name in her voice after all these years hit him harder than he'd expected. For a moment, just a moment, he was 14 again, bleeding on alien soil, completely out of his depth, and trying to pretend he wasn't terrified. But only for a moment. "I've spent 10 years preparing for this conversation," he said quietly. "I learned your language, studied your culture, mastered every skill I thought might matter. I've led diplomatic missions to 7 worlds and helped prevent 2 wars. I've seen things that would have broken the boy you met in that forest." And yet, Elia stepped closer, close enough that he had to resist the urge to step back. "You came back, after all this time, across all this distance, to honor a promise made to a child. Some might say that's exactly what a boy would do." Eli felt something twist in his chest. Had he really traveled across half the galaxy, spent 10 years of his life preparing for this moment, just to be told he hadn't changed enough? Then Elia smiled, and it was like watching the triple suns rise all at once. "Others might say," she continued softly, "that only a man would have the courage to keep a promise that foolish, or the wisdom to understand what I was really offering you." The tension in Eli's shoulders eased slightly. "And what were you offering me?" "A chance to prove that humanity deserves its place among the stars, not as junior partners or amusing curiosities, but as equals." Her expression grew serious, and Eli caught a glimpse of the weight she carried as a guardian. The trial of unity isn't just about personal worthiness, Eli. It's about whether your entire species has what it takes to stand alongside civilizations that have walked between worlds for millennia. The weight of that statement settled on Eli like a lead blanket. He'd come here thinking this was about personal redemption, about keeping a promise to a beautiful alien girl who'd kissed his forehead under strange stars. He was starting to realize it was about so much more. "No pressure," Eli muttered, and was surprised when Elia laughed. It was a sound like silver bells mixed with ocean waves, and it reminded him powerfully of why he'd carried the memory of her for 10 years. "You still make jokes when you're very nervous," she observed. "Some things don't change." "Some things shouldn't," he replied, then took a deep breath. "What does the trial involve?" Elia's expression grew solemn. 3 tests, each more difficult than the last. The first measures your ability to face your own darkness without being consumed by it. The second tests your harmony with life itself. The third— She paused, and for the first time since he'd arrived, she looked uncertain. "The third is the bonding." a complete merger of consciousness with a Thalrune guardian. It requires absolute trust, complete vulnerability, and a willingness to let another being see every truth about yourself, even the ones you hide from yourself. And if I follow you, the first trial might leave you broken in spirit, unable to trust your own perceptions. The second could kill you outright if you prove incompatible with the living systems we'll connect you to. The third, Alia looked away. The third would leave you alive, but empty. No capacity for emotional connection, no ability to feel love or durate or even simple companionship. You would be technically functional, but essentially hollow for the rest of your life. Eli considered this. He thought about the boy who charged 3 void stalkers with nothing but a broken crystal and sheer stubborn courage. He thought about the man who'd spent 10 years preparing for this moment, who'd built his entire adult life around the goal of being worthy of this challenge. "When do we start?" he asked. Alia studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Tomorrow at dawn, but Eli," she reached out and touched his arm just briefly. "There's something else you should know. The trial has never been attempted by a human because we weren't sure your species could survive it. Your brain chemistry, your neural pathways, everything about how you process reality is different from ours." "Are you trying to talk me out of it?" "I'm trying to make sure you understand what you're risking. If you succeed, you'll be the first human to achieve unity status with the Thalrune. You'll have a voice in galactic affairs that could change the course of human history." She stepped back, and suddenly she wasn't just Alia anymore. She was Guardian Alia, speaker for an ancient civilization, weighing the fate of 2 species in her amber eyes. "If you fail," she continued, "you'll be a cautionary tale about human arrogance and the price of reaching too high, too fast." Eli looked up at the crystalline spires reaching toward alien stars, then back at the woman who'd shaped the last 10 years of his life with a single kiss and a handful of words. "Guess we'll find out which story gets told," he said. Dawn on Thalrune wasn't like anything Eli had ever experienced, and he'd seen sunrises on 16 different worlds. 3 suns rose in sequence, each casting different colored shadows that danced and merged until the entire world seemed to pulse with living light. Alia led him to a structure that defied every law of physics Eli thought he understood. The chamber of reflection looked like someone had built a room out of crystallized thoughts, its walls shifting between transparent and opaque, showing glimpses of things that might have been memories or might have been nightmares. "The first trial begins the moment you step inside," Alia explained, her voice unusually gentle. "You'll face every fear, every failure, every moment of doubt you've ever buried. The chamber will use them against you, trying to break your spirit before you can prove your worth." "Any advice?" Eli asked, trying to project confidence he didn't entirely feel. "Remember who you are now, not who you were then. The chamber feeds on shame and regret, but it can't touch acceptance and growth." Alia paused, her expression troubled. "And Eli, the chamber will show you versions of me, versions that say cruel things, that mock your feelings, that tell you this was all an elaborate joke. Don't believe them." Before Eli could ask what she meant by that warning, the chamber's entrance dilated open like an iris, revealing swirling darkness beyond. He stepped inside. The first thing that hit him wasn't visual, it was auditory. The sound of his father's voice, slurred with alcohol and thick with the disappointment that had colored every conversation they'd had after Eli's 8th birthday. "You're nothing special, boy. Nothing you do will ever matter. You think you're going to save the galaxy. You can't even save your old man from himself." Then the chamber filled with images, each one a perfect recreation of Eli's worst memories. His father walking away when Eli was 8, a bottle in one hand and a duffel bag in the other, never looking back even when Eli called after him. His first diplomatic mission, where his cultural ignorance had nearly started a war between 2 species that had been at peace for centuries. The faces of soldiers who died under his command because he'd made the wrong call, because he'd been too proud to ask for help when he should have. Every moment of doubt, every failure, every time he'd been less than the man he wanted to be. But the worst came last. It was Alia, but not as she really was. This version of her was cruel, mocking her, beautiful features twisted into an expression of disdain. "Did you really think I cared about some pathetic human boy?" The false Alia laughed a sound like breaking glass. You were entertainment, nothing more. A curiosity. I wanted to see what would happen if I gave hope to something so desperate for meaning. The image circled him, her voice growing more vicious with each word. And now you're a man who's wasted 10 years chasing a fantasy. 10 years you could have spent building a real life, finding real love, making a real difference. Instead, you've thrown it all away for a promise that was never real. For a moment, Eli felt something break inside him. The doubt he'd carried for a decade, the fear that maybe he'd built his entire adult life around a misunderstanding threatened to drown him in despair. This was his greatest fear, made manifest that everything he'd done, everything he'd become, was based on a lie. But then he remembered the real Alia's warning. And more than that, he remembered the way she'd looked at him yesterday, not with mockery or disdain, but with something that might have been hope, might have been pride, might even have been love. You're not her, he said quietly to the false image. She warned me about you. The chamber shuddered, its illusions wavering like heat mirages. The real Alia saw something in me worth saving. Eli continued, his voice growing stronger. She saw potential for growth, for becoming something better. You're just the voice of my own insecurity, and I'm done listening to it. He pressed forward past the jeering voices and phantom failures until he reached the center of the chamber, where a simple crystal pedestal waited. He placed his hand on it, and the chamber filled with blinding light. When his vision cleared, he was standing outside the chamber, alive and whole, with Alia waiting for him. How do you feel? She asked, studying his face carefully. Like I just had a very expensive therapy session, Eli replied, then grew serious. But also like I understand something about myself that I didn't before. And what's that? That I'm not the boy who charged those void stalkers anymore. That boy was brave but desperate, acting on instinct and hope. I'm someone who's chosen to be here, who's prepared for what comes next. Alia smiled, and Eli felt something warm settle in his chest. Good. You'll need that certainty for what comes next. The second trial took place in a section of Thalrun that existed partially in normal space and partially in what Alia called the dimension of living thought. The trees here weren't just alive in the biological sense, they were aware, their consciousness flowing between them like an underground river connecting distant oceans. You must find the heart of the grove, Alia explained as they stood at the forest edge. But you cannot use any technology, any weapons, any tools except what the forest itself provides. And Eli, the forest will test your intentions with every step. What she didn't tell him, what neither of them knew, was that Refugee, a member of the Thalrun Council, who believed humans were a contamination of galactic civilization, was secretly manipulating parts of the trial. Refugee was old even by Thalrun standards. He had been present when humanity first made contact with the galactic community, and he had not been impressed. In his view, humans were chaotic, violent, unpredictable creatures who brought disorder wherever they went. The idea that one of them might achieve unity status, might gain a voice in affairs that had been managed peacefully for millennia without human interference, was abhorrent to him. So as Eli entered the grove, Refugee was deep in meditation, his consciousness connected to the forest network, subtly influencing the trial to be far more dangerous than it should have been. Eli entered the grove as the morning light filtered through leaves that seemed to whisper his name in languages he didn't recognize. The path shifted beneath his feet, leading him deeper into a maze that rearranged itself based on his thoughts and emotions. Hours passed, the trees began to speak to him, not in words, but in feelings transmitted directly into his mind. Some were welcoming, curious about this strange new form of consciousness that had wandered into their domain. Others were suspicious, testing his resolve with false paths and phantom dangers. But as the day wore on, Eli began to notice that the challenges were escalating beyond what seemed reasonable. The paths became more treacherous, leading him over chasms that shouldn't have existed, past predators that seemed more aggressive than they should have been. Someone was making this harder than it was supposed to be. That's when he found the injured creature. It was small, barely the size of a house cat, with fur that shifted color like oil on water and eyes that held distinctly intelligent pain. One of its legs was caught in what looked like a thorn trap, and it was bleeding a luminescent blue substance onto the forest floor. Eli knew this was part of the test. Everything here was. But as he knelt beside the creature, he realized the test wasn't about finding the heart of the grove at all. It was about what kind of person he was when no one was watching, when helping meant sacrificing his own goals. He spent precious time freeing the creature, using strips torn from his own clothing to bandage its wounds. The creature looked at him with those intelligent eyes, made a sound like silver chimes mixed with gratitude, and bounded away into the undergrowth. That simple act of compassion changed something fundamental in the forest's response to him. The trees that had been testing him began to guide him instead. The paths that had been treacherous became clear. And slowly, gradually, Eli began to understand what the heart of the grove really was. It wasn't a place or an object. It was a moment of perfect understanding between different forms of consciousness. As he walked deeper into the forest, Eli felt his awareness expanding, connecting not just with the trees, but with every living thing in the grove. For just an instant, he experienced what it was like to be truly connected to a vast network of life, to understand that consciousness wasn't limited to individual beings, but could be shared, expanded, multiplied into something greater than the sum of its parts. He emerged from the forest carrying a seed of crystal that pulsed with the same rhythm as his heartbeat, but more importantly, he emerged with a fundamental shift in how he understood existence itself, and with the growing certainty that someone had been actively trying to make him fail. Aiellia was waiting for him outside the grove, her face a mixture of pride and concern. "You felt it too, didn't you?" she said quietly. "The interference. Someone's been messing about with the trials," Eli confirmed, wiping forest sap from his hands. "Any idea who?" Aiellia glanced around, then led him to a secluded alcove where crystalline formations provided both privacy and a natural dampening field for electronic surveillance. "There are those among my people who believe the trials should remain pure, unchanged by outside influence," she said carefully. "They see humanity's participation as contamination." "And you, what do you see?" She looked at him with those amber eyes that had haunted his dreams for a decade, and for a moment her official guardian composure slipped, revealing something deeper underneath. "I see the most stubborn, impossible, wonderful species the galaxy has ever produced," she said softly. "I see beings who charge armed predators to save strangers. I see a people who spend 10 years preparing to keep a promise to someone they met for 5 minutes. That's not exactly a ringing endorsement of our intelligence." Aiellia smiled, but it was touched with sadness. "Intelligence is common in the galaxy, Eli. Wisdom is rarer. But what you call stubbornness, what you call impossible loyalty, that's rarest of all." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of difficult truths. "The final trial is different from the others. The bonding isn't just a test of worthiness, it's a fundamental merger of consciousness that creates a permanent connection between the participants. If it succeeds, you and I will be linked for the rest of our lives." Eli felt something cold settle in his stomach. "And if it fails, you would be alive but empty. No capacity for emotional connection, no ability to feel love or bond or even simple companionship. You would be technically functional, but essentially hollow for the rest of your life." "And you, what happens to you if it fails?" Aiellia looked away. "The same fate. We succeed together, or we fall together." The implications hit Eli like a physical blow. She wasn't just offering him a chance at unity status. She was willing to risk everything. She was everything she could ever be on his worthiness. "Why?" he asked quietly. "Why would you take that risk?" "Because 10 years ago, a human boy showed me something I'd never seen before. Pure courage in the face of impossible odds, selflessness that transcended species barriers, a willingness to sacrifice everything for someone he'd just met." She turned back to him, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. If that's what humanity is capable of at its worst, what might it achieve at its best? Before Eli could respond, they heard footsteps approaching. Elder Zethmirin appeared, his expression grim, followed by several other council members. "Guardian Aiellia, there's been a development," Zethmirin announced. "Councillor Refugee has formally challenged the humans' right to attempt the final trial. He's demanding a formal debate before the full council." Elia's jaw tightened. "On what grounds?" "He claims the humans' neural patterns are incompatible with the bonding process, that attempting it would be tantamount to suicide, and that allowing it would make us complicit in his death." Zethmirin's expression suggested he didn't entirely disagree with the assessment. He also argues that the human has already shown dangerous instability by somehow altering the first two trials. "I didn't alter anything," Eli protested. You survived challenges that should have broken you," another council member interrupted. "You connected with the forest in ways that took our own people decades to achieve. Either you're far more dangerous than we realized, or someone has been helping you in ways that invalidate the trials entirely." Eli felt the careful control he'd maintained throughout the trials beginning to slip. After everything he'd been through, after 10 years of preparation, was it all going to end in a bureaucratic argument? "When is this debate?" Elia asked, her voice carefully neutral. "1 hour," Sethmiran replied. "But Guardian Elia, you should know that Refugee has considerable influence among the Elder Councils. If he convinces them that the risk is too great, then humanity's chance at true partnership in galactic affairs dies with my application," Eli finished. As they walked toward what might be his final confrontation, Eli realized that the real trial had never been about facing his fears or connecting with alien forests. It had been about proving that humanity deserved to be here at all. And now, with everything hanging in the balance, he was about to face his greatest challenge, yet convincing an ancient civilization that humans could be trusted with power that could reshape the galaxy. The council chamber was a vast space that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Thalrune counselors sat in crystalline chairs that floated at different levels throughout the chamber, their forms occasionally phasing in and out of visibility as they moved between dimensions of thought and reality. The architecture itself was designed to be humbling. Every angle, every surface, every play of light was calculated to remind visitors that they stood in the presence of a civilization that had mastered technologies humanity could barely comprehend. Refugee stood at the center of the chamber, his skin darker than the others, marked with scars that suggested a warrior's past. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, someone who had shaped policy for centuries. "Honored counselors," he began, his words echoing through dimensions of space that Eli couldn't quite perceive. "We stand at a crossroads. This human seeks to undergo the bonding, a sacred ritual that has never been attempted by his species. I submit that allowing this is not courage, but recklessness that endangers us all." Murmurs rippled through the assembly like waves through water. Eli could feel the mood of the room shifting against him with each word Refugee spoke. Furthermore, Refugee continued, his voice growing stronger. "Humans are a violent, unpredictable species. Their neural patterns are chaotic, driven by primitive emotions and base instincts. Their history is one of endless conflict, of destroying their own environment, of proving time and again that they cannot be trusted with power." He gestured toward Eli with obvious disdain. "This individual has already demonstrated dangerous instability. He has somehow manipulated our trials, achieving results that should have been impossible for his species. Either he possesses abilities we don't understand, making him a potential threat, or he has received outside assistance, making the trials meaningless." More murmurs, louder now. Eli felt like he was watching his future slip away, one word at a time. "To bond with such a mind," Refugee concluded, "could corrupt one of our guardians permanently, could introduce chaos into the ordered consciousness that has guided our people for millennia. I ask you, is satisfying human ambition worth risking everything we are?" The silence that followed was heavy with consideration. Eli could see counselors exchanging glances, their expressions troubled. Then Aelia rose from her chair, and when she spoke, her voice cut through the chamber like a crystal blade. "Counselor Refugee speaks of corruption." She said, her words carrying harmonics that made the chamber itself seem to listen. "But I have studied this human for 10 years. I have examined his memories, his motivations, his actions under pressure. If there is corruption here, it lies not in his mind, but in our fear of change." She moved to stand beside Eli, and he felt strength flow from her presence. Yes, humans are chaotic. Yes, they are driven by emotions we sometimes find difficult to understand. But they are also capable of extraordinary compassion, of sacrifice that transcends species barriers, of growth that defies prediction. Elia turned to address the full council, her voice growing stronger with each word. 10 years ago, this human, then just a child, risked his life to save mine. He gained nothing from it. He expected nothing in return. He acted purely from moral conviction, from a belief that life had value regardless of its form. One act of childhood heroism does not qualify, Refugee began. One act, Elia interrupted, and for the first time Eli heard steel in her voice. Captain Vance has spent 10 years preparing for this moment. He has mastered our language, our culture, our philosophy. He has prevented wars, saved lives, proven again and again that humans are capable of wisdom when given the chance. She paused, and when she continued, her voice carried a note of personal conviction that made several counselors lean forward. But more than that, he has shown me something I thought impossible. That connection between species doesn't have to be limited by biology or culture. That consciousness can expand beyond the boundaries we've accepted for millennia. You would risk your own consciousness for this experiment, Refugee demanded. I would risk everything, Ilya replied without hesitation, for the chance to prove that unity transcends species. The debate that followed raged for what felt like hours. Some counselors spoke of precedent and tradition, of the dangers of allowing change to come too quickly. Others argued for the potential benefits of human partnership, of the unique perspectives they might bring to galactic affairs. But in the end, it came down to a simple question. Was humanity ready to be trusted with true power? Elder Zethmirin called for silence, and the chamber fell still as the council members entered into what Eli later learned was a form of collective meditation, their consciousness briefly merging to reach consensus. When they emerged from the meditation, Zethmirin's expression was grave. The council is divided, he announced. By the narrowest of margins, we grant permission for the trial to proceed. But, he added, his voice heavy with warning, any sign of danger to Guardian Alia, any indication that the human's consciousness is incompatible with the bonding process, and we will terminate the connection immediately. Eli felt something that might have been relief, might have been terror, settle in his chest. He'd won the right to attempt the impossible, but success was far from guaranteed. 30 minutes later, he and Aelia stood in the bonding chamber, a sphere of perfect crystal suspended in the center of a vast space that seemed to extend infinitely in all directions. She wore robes that looked like they'd been woven from starlight itself, and her jade hair flowed freely around her shoulders. The silver threads he'd noticed earlier caught the chamber's ethereal light, creating patterns that seemed to shift and dance with her breathing. This is where we find out if everything we've both believed for 10 years is true, she said softly. The bonding itself began simply enough. They sat facing each other in the center of the crystal sphere, their hands touching, their eyes locked. Aelia began to speak in the ancient Thalruan ritual language, words that seemed to resonate with the chamber itself. Then the barriers between their minds began to dissolve. It started as a trickle of shared sensation. Eli could feel Elia's heartbeat, could sense the rhythm of her breathing. Then the trickle became a stream, and suddenly he was experiencing her memories as if they were his own. Her childhood under the triple suns, learning to manipulate energy with her thoughts. Her training as a guardian, the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a mantle she could never remove. Her loneliness as one of the few of her generation who believed that connection between species was not just possible but necessary. And he felt the moment when she decided to save him in that forest 10 years ago. It hadn't been impulse or simple kindness, it had been recognition. She'd seen in that bleeding human boy the potential for something that had never existed before, true partnership between species. But the flow went both ways. Aelia experienced Eli's memories with the same intensity, feeling his emotions as if they were her own. His journey from scared child to determined man, his doubts and fears and moments of triumph. His absolute certainty that keeping his promise to her was worth any risk, any sacrifice. She felt the loneliness he'd carried, the way he'd built his entire adult life around the goal of being worthy of her challenge. The way he'd never allowed himself to form deep connections with others because part of his heart had always belonged to an alien girl he'd met for 5 minutes under strange stars. As their consciousness merged more deeply, Eli began to understand things about the Thalruan that no human had ever known. Their philosophy of existence, their understanding of consciousness as something that could be shared and expanded, their fear that younger species might bring chaos to the careful order they'd maintained for millennia. And Alia began to understand humans in a way that transformed her perception of what they might become. She felt the intensity of human emotion, the way they could love and hate and hope with a passion that burned like solar fire. She understood their capacity for growth, for change, for becoming something greater than what they'd been. The bonding was proceeding perfectly, their consciousness merging into something new and unprecedented when the attack came. Without warning, their merged consciousness was flooded with pure malevolence. It was like having acid poured into their shared mind, a wave of psychic poison that threatened to shatter their connection before it could fully form. Refugee had found a way to interfere with the bonding itself, projecting his own consciousness into their merger and trying to corrupt it from within. His thoughts were a torrent of hatred and fear, convinced that allowing humans to achieve unity status would doom Thalrun's civilization. For a terrifying moment, Eli felt their connection fracturing. Elia's presence in his mind began to fade, replaced by a creeping coldness that whispered he would never be worthy, never be enough, never truly belong among the stars. But worse than his own despair was feeling Aelia's pain as the psychic assault tore at her consciousness. She was trying to shield him from the worst of it, and the effort was destroying her from within. That's when Eli made a choice that surprised even himself. Instead of fighting the darkness, instead of trying to push it away, he embraced it. He pulled every bit of Rekshi's hatred and fear into himself, wrapping his consciousness around it like a blanket, shielding Aelia from the assault at the cost of his own mental stability. "You don't have to carry this alone." Elia's voice echoed in his mind, weak but determined. "Yes, I do," Eli replied, his mental voice steady despite the agony tearing through his thoughts. "This is what humans do. We bear burdens so others don't have to. We take the darkness into ourselves so others can walk in light." And in that moment, something unprecedented happened. The darkness that Refugee had sent to destroy them began to change. Eli's absolute determination to protect Aelia, his willingness to sacrifice his own consciousness for hers, transformed the psychic poison into something else entirely. Instead of corrupting their bond, the attack became fuel for it. The hatred and fear that was meant to drive them apart became the foundation for a connection deeper than anything the Thalrun had ever experienced. Their merged consciousness didn't just survive the assault, it transcended it. The bond between them evolved into something that was neither fully human nor fully Thalrun, but something greater than either species had ever achieved alone. Light exploded from the bonding chamber, visible across the entire city, a beacon that announced the birth of something new in the galaxy. When the light faded, Eli and Aelia stood in the chamber, their hands still joined but fundamentally changed. Along Eli's arms and throat, faint lines of bioluminescent energy pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat, the mark of unity, proof that the impossible had happened. But more than that, their consciousness remained partially merged even after the bonding was complete. They could feel each other's emotions, sense each other's thoughts, communicate without words across any distance. Outside the chamber, the Thalrun Council waited in stunned silence. Even Refugee, his face a mask of disbelief and something that might have been grudging respect, could not deny what had occurred. In 3,000 years of recorded history, Elder Zethmirin announced, his voice carrying wonder and awe. "No being has ever transformed the trial of unity itself. Captain Eli Vance has not simply passed our tests, he has evolved them, shown us possibilities we never imagined." The implications hit the chamber like a shockwave. For the first time in galactic history, a human had achieved full partnership status with one of the ancient species. But more than that, the nature of the bond itself had evolved, creating possibilities that none of them had imagined. Refugee approached slowly, his warriors bearing intact, despite his obvious shock. "I was wrong about your species, Captain Vance." He said the words clearly difficult for him. "The bond you've created, the way you transformed our trial itself. It suggests capabilities we never suspected humans possessed." "It suggests," Eli replied carefully, his voice still slightly unsteady from the ordeal, "that maybe it's time for all of us to stop thinking in terms of your species and my species. Maybe it's time to start thinking about what we can become together." Over the following days, as news of the successful bonding spread across Thalrun and then to the wider galaxy, Eli found himself at the center of a transformation he'd never expected. Diplomatic missions that had stalled for decades suddenly found new momentum. Species that had been suspicious of human motives began to reconsider their positions. The Galactic Council, which had kept humanity on probationary status for 37 years, suddenly found themselves dealing with a species that had achieved something they'd thought impossible. Within weeks, humanity's status was upgraded to full membership with all the rights and responsibilities that entailed. But for Eli, the real victory came in quieter moments. When Ilia looked at him with those amber eyes and smiled the same smile that had haunted his dreams for a decade, except now he could feel the love behind it flowing through their bond like warm sunlight. When they stood together on the crystal balcony of the Guardian complex, watching the triple suns set over a city that was learning to see humanity as partners rather than problems, and he felt their merged consciousness humming between them like a bridge between worlds. "So," she said one evening, echoing her words from 10 years ago, "the boy returns." "Actually," Eli replied, lifting their joined hands to show the energy flowing between them like visible proof of their connection. "I think something entirely new just began." The mark of unity on his skin pulsed brighter for a moment, responding to their shared emotion, and Alia laughed. It was the same sound like silver bells mixed with ocean waves that he remembered, but now he could feel the joy behind it flowing through their bond. "Yes," she agreed, her mental voice joining her spoken words in perfect harmony. "Something new, something impossible, something perfectly, stubbornly human." As the stars emerged in the alien sky above them, Eli Vance realized he'd done more than keep a promise or pass a test. He'd opened a door between species, proving that sometimes the most powerful bonds are forged, not in spite of differences, but because of them. The boy who charged 3 Voidstalkers with nothing but a broken crystal and sheer courage had become the man who charged into the unknown with nothing but a 10-year-old promise and unshakable determination. And in doing so, he'd given humanity something it had never had before, a true place among the stars earned not through conquest or compromise, but through the simple act of keeping faith with someone who believed in them when no one else would. Some promises, it turned out, were worth waiting for. Some promises were worth any risk. And sometimes the most human thing you could do was prove that being human was enough. The galaxy would never be the same. And maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what it needed. What did you think about Eli's incredible journey from a lost boy to the bridge between 2 civilizations? Have you ever had to wait years to prove yourself worthy of something you believed in? I want to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Share your own stories of keeping impossible promises or overcoming challenges that seemed too big to handle. And if this story about humanity finding its place among the stars resonated with you, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We've got more epic sci-fi tales coming your way, stories that will make you proud to be human and excited about our future among the stars. Because sometimes the best way to reach for the stars is to remember that we're already made of stardust. We just need the courage to shine bright enough for the galaxy to notice. Until next time, keep that human spirit burning bright. The universe is vast and full of wonders, but it's also waiting to see what impossible thing we'll do next. And if Eli Vance taught us anything, it's that humans have a talent for making the impossible look routine. Thanks for joining me on this journey across the stars. Now go out there and prove that being human is the most extraordinary thing in the galaxy.